Laudetur Jesus Christus, per omnia saecula. Amen. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Domestic Church. Now, I've entitled this week's episode Simili Modo, which I hope some of you will recognize from the canon of the Mass. Simili modo postquam cenatum est, likewise after supper. Simili modo then means likewise. Now, some of you perhaps know the anecdote about the chap who was looking for inspiration from Holy Scripture and decided to try an old trick that someone else had recommended to him. And so took the Holy Scriptures, closed his eyes, let the book fold open, put his finger on a page and read it. And it said, Judas went and hung himself. So he thought, well, that's not very helpful. That's not very inspirational. So I'll try that again. So he closes the book, opens it, lets it fall open wherever it may, puts his finger down, having closed his eyes, on the page, opens his eyes to read the verse. And there are the words, simili modo, go and do likewise. Well, one of the things I want to discuss this evening is along the lines of similarities and dissimilarities. In part, this is a question that has been asked from an avid viewer. So, as always, I intend to try and answer the questions that you suggest and put forward. And this question is about what are the similarities or dissimilarities between Old Romans and the Society of St. Pius X. Now, this is an interesting question because the short answer perhaps is not a lot, in the sense that the polity of the society and the Old Romans is very similar. In fact, we are in a very similar, irregular canonical situation, which is not the doing of any of us, but instead has been put upon us, we might say, by Rome. For us as Old Romans, of course, it was when Pius IX annexed the ancient see of Utrecht in the Netherlands and erected a new hierarchy in 1853. For the SSPX, it was when Rome suspended their canonical foundation. They had originally been canonically erected in, I think, 3 dioceses by the time of the suppression. Initially, of course, in Switzerland at Ecumenical and then elsewhere. But I think it was in 76 or 77, they were officially suppressed by the Holy See, meaning that their canonical status was taken away from them. Now, likewise, this was unfair, unjust, ill-advised, imprudent, and Marcel Lefebvre, Archbishop Lefebvre, decided to continue. Indeed, he raised objections, but these were not heard. Likewise, the same was true of us as Old Romans, way back in the mid-19th century. Likewise, the ultra-Jectine bishops raised objections to the establishment of a new hierarchy, but to no avail. So in that sense, in terms of origins, in terms of how these two respective organizations began, is very similar. Likewise, of course, we are both 100% committed to the traditional Latin Mass and to the traditional Catholic faith, to the traditional Catholic priesthood and its continuance. Again, then we are very similar in our attitude and appreciation toward contemporary Rome, to the present crisis, which we both perceive to be as a result of Vatican II and particularly the Novus Ordo Missae, the new order of Mass. And in that respect, certainly, Old Romans and the SSPX are very similar. So in what ways are we different? Well, culturally, perhaps we are a little different from one another, in the sense that I suppose we would say that as old Romans, we are simply continuing that which we received, that which we've always known. There was, when we were separated from Rome, no new Mass, and we've continued stoically and solidly adhering to the Tridentine rite of Mass, without any changes. We haven't adopted any of the 20th century liturgical innovations. We still say the older form of the breviary or the diurnal. We didn't adopt the new missals of the 20th century. We still have the old form of Holy Week. We never adopted the 1955 changes. And so in that sense, we are different from the SSPX, who, of course, used the 1962 missal. Now, we might say there that perhaps there is a difference of appreciation between us with regard to sacred tradition. I suppose in one sense, from the old Roman perspective, we might say of the SSPX that they are perhaps a little more legalistic or legally positivistic than we old Romans. That is to say, the reason why the SSPX used the 1962 missal is because it was the last authorized edition of the Tridentine Rite in Latin, entirely in Latin. But on our part, as old Romans, we would never use the 1962 missal because, from our perspective, it's too modern. From our perspective, of course, the 1962 missal contains the 1955 Holy Week, that first recovation by Annibale Brunini under the auspices of Pius XII. And the rubrics were altered in 1960 for the Mass and for the breviary. And so for us as old Romans, the 62 missal to us represents a break, essentially, in tradition. It represents a break in tradition because it is not, it is an altered Roman missal. It's not the same as the, essentially, the 1884 missal that we use still. It is different. Now, we might say, well, that's perhaps splitting hairs, and to a point, one could agree with that in the sense that, well, the 62 is still the Vetus Ordo. It still has it has everything that the older missals have, except for Holy Week, and of course it adds one or two things as well. But that's the kind of the only difference. Otherwise, one arguably could say that the 1962 missal perpetuates the perennial magisterium of the Church in its liturgical expression. To a point, one I think as old Romans we would concede that. So we wouldn't say that the 62 missal was heinous. Rather, we would say it is unfortunate, and unfortunate because of that break with tradition, because of those changes, and most especially that of Pius XII and the new Holy Week, because the new Holy Week of 1955 really was a complete recovation of the old Holy Week. It barely resembles any similarity with the ancient form of Holy Week that had been offered by the Church for at least 1,000 years, if not longer. So there's that difference, and perhaps there's that difference, we might say, with regard to an appreciation for sacred tradition. So that for the SSPX, clearly it is possible for the missal to be changed, and fairly significantly, whereas as Old Romans we would resist any change really whatsoever, and say, apart from minor changes like the addition of new propers for new saints, otherwise really the missal should be left as it is. In that respect, I suppose we might be reversely called legal positivists for our adherence to Quo Primum, which was the document that promulgated the Tridentine Missal, wherein St. Pius V says that nothing should be changed, nothing should be altered. But again, we recognize, of course, that between Pius V and the 19th century, some changes have been made, some additions, impropers have been made, etc. So, and I think that's also perhaps culturally an important difference between us. Is for us, sacred tradition is very much something that is living. So although we say that we hold to the older editions of the Missal, and that we don't change we don't accept the later changes. On the other hand, if you're familiar with the broadcast of My Daily Mass, or if you attend one of our chapels, you may see slight differences. For example, I broadcast a daily low mass, and it is essentially a low mass, but it's low mass with hymns. Now, there are various tradies who would raise their hands in shock at the idea of hymns at a low mass, but the reasoning for us having hymns, from my reasoning for having hymns, is because it aids devotion. That is to say, that bearing in mind that these low masses are being broadcast at the offertory and the canon, essentially, if there was no hymn, you wouldn't hear anything, because the prayers and the canon are said sotto voce. They're said in the secret voice and the quiet voice, and you wouldn't hear anything. Now, if you're a viewer, if you're watching online, it is quite likely that you will become easily distracted if there is a prolonged period of silence on whatever you're watching. For example, if I stopped speaking now and just went quiet, after about 30 seconds, a minute, you would become distracted by any other sound you heard. And if I carried on being just silent, you would either mentally turn off, or you would literally turn off and go somewhere else. So part of the reason why in my broadcast low mass we have a hymn at the offertory more often than not is to arrest the viewer's attention, to arrest the worshipper's attention, to keep you, as it were, not entertained, not to keep you entertained, but to keep you devotionally attentive. At least that's the intention. I mean, if that doesn't work, tell me in the comments. But I tend to use familiar hymns, which for most people the words will be familiar, and the hope is that you are listening to the hymn, or even singing the hymn at home at the offertory. So that's purposefully designed to keep and arrest your attention. Now, the SSPX and various other contemporary traditionalists wouldn't do that. You know, a low mass is a low mass, and if it goes quiet, it goes quiet. They wouldn't add music. So what I suppose, and there are some who would even go so far as to say, oh, you know, well, you can't have music at a low mass. That's an abuse, etc. Well, actually, in tradition, low mass with hymns was very often the way that the main mass on Sundays was offered in many parishes. In small parishes where there wasn't a schola, where there wasn't a choir, where there weren't sacred ministers, where Holy Mass could be rarely offered, and the Solemn Mass or Missa Cantata could be rarely offered, then a low mass with hymns was quite usual. In the 18th century and 19th century, there was the tradition in some places during low mass of organ accompaniment. So the priest would be saying the mass at the altar, and the organ would be accompanying the mass. That was very common. And again, part of the reason for that was to arrest the devotion of the congregation, to keep them, as it were, focused and tuned in to worship. So within sacred tradition, you know, sacred tradition is not, and this is what always makes me laugh whenever Pope Francis talks about Pharisaical rigidity amongst traditionalists, because amongst, I would say, true traditionalists, that doesn't exist. That kind of attitude doesn't exist. At the end of the day, what we're all about is the salvation of souls. What we're all about re-offering the liturgy is the edification of souls and of enabling souls to worship. But as I say, that perhaps is a cultural difference in approach or attitude from us as Old Romans and the SSPX and various other traditional Catholics who can be very rigid, I suppose, about the way things are done. That said, the SSPX itself has its own kind of eccentricities, we might say, liturgically. So that, for example, when the SSPX bishops celebrate a pontifical mass, they use the throne. They use a throne as opposed to the fallstool. So when a bishop offers the most solemn form of pontifical liturgy, if he is the diocesan bishop, or if he has the diocesan bishop's permission, then he will celebrate using the throne, the bishop's throne, which is generally on the north side of the sanctuary. When a bishop offers pontifical mass, but he is not the diocesan and doesn't have permission from the diocesan ordinary to use the throne, then he will use what's called a faldstool, which is a chair, literally a folding chair, which is placed on the epistle side of the sanctuary. Now, the SSPX, who, note, are, by their own definition, auxiliary bishops, who hold no titles whatsoever, and certainly they would disclaim holding any kind of jurisdiction whatsoever, and yet whenever they celebrate a pontifical high mass, they always do so from the throne. Now, it may be that, and I've heard it suggested, that if that the reason why the SSPX bishops use a throne is because they are simply following what Archbishop Lefebvre used to do. Now, I don't know this for certain, but it's quite possible that Archbishop Lefebvre was given some kind of dispensation as a former apostolic legate to West Africa, as he had been, to use a throne even outside of his diocese or ordinary jurisdiction. May well have been the case, but that isn't, even if that were the case, it isn't a correct justification for the bishops who followed him to then simili modo do likewise. They should really use a full stall. And amongst Old Romans, you will notice that even though we would claim to tentatively exercise a limited kind of jurisdiction, we never use thrones, but we always use full stalls. So even though I am regarded as the primus, the first among equals of our bishops, I would never use a throne to offer a pontifical mass. I would always use a full stall, because essentially to make the point that we recognize that we do not have canonical jurisdiction in the fullest sense and understanding. So we don't exercise an ordinary canonical authority like a diocesan bishop, even though we may govern in the same fashion in terms of our own clergy and faithful and chapels, etc. So that's another difference between ourselves and the SSPX. But aside from those things, really, we're otherwise very similar. We're very similar. We both, broadly speaking, adopt the recognize and resist position, in that we recognize that the Pope is the Pope. We recognize that he is formally the Pope, that he was elected, that we have to assume that the conclave that elected him was valid, but we resist him. Some may call that disobedience, but we resist him because we believe him to be in error about various things, but particularly about the faith and the application of the faith and the teaching of faith. So in that, the SSPX and Old Romans are very similar. And then otherwise, there are cultural differences in the sense that, every human organization, every human society develops its own kind of culture and a kind of ethos and a kind of attitude and way of doing things. Arguably, the SSPX are very, I would say, very formal in their ethos, whereas as Old Romans, we tend to be a little more relaxed by comparison. We all know what should and shouldn't be done. We all know how things should and shouldn't be done, but it all depends really on circumstances and situations. If you're offering, for example, a pontifical mass in a missionary chapel because of confirmations, yes, it would be nice to be able to offer the mass in a solemn pontifical fashion, but if it's just not possible because the wherewithal is just not there and the manpower is just not there, then you have to adapt to situation. And I think that's something that often perhaps those who would denigrate or deride ourselves and the SSPX is a lack of appreciation often for the missionary aspect to our ministry. We as Old Romans particularly, are primarily, we are missionaries. The SSPX arguably could be said to be likewise missionaries. We are missionaries for tradition. We are missionaries for the Orthodox Catholic faith. We are missionaries for sacred tradition. And as everybody knows, there's always been some appreciable latitude given to missionary apostolates and their realizations, because when you're in the mission field, sometimes you just don't have the things that it would be nice to have or one ought to have, and one has to improvise according to situation and circumstance. But often, the rad trads online will often divide us or the SSPX because they've watched some video where perhaps the wherewithal wasn't all there, and so they denigrate us for adaptation. But at the end of the day, it's we in the SSPX would prefer that everything that could be done and should be done was done, but sometimes it's just not practicable. And there we might say the principle of economia applies, that Holy Church, as it were, forgives, makes allowances, and supplies whatever is lacking in order that what we do is nonetheless valid and ultimately worthy and efficacious. At the end of the day, for us old Romans and the SSPX, we would both agree that these are extraordinary times, and for both of us, we would rather that the situation was different. Of course, we would rather not be in an irregular canonical status. We would rather not have to fend for ourselves. We would rather not have to beg, borrow, or build new missions and chapels, etc. We would much rather, of course, be able to use and have access to and be involved in the inheritance of our forefathers that the institutional church carries. Who wouldn't rather say Mass in a beautiful Baroque parish church than in however well improvised a missionary chapel may be? Of course, we regret that this is the situation. We don't prefer it, except that what we do, we believe, is preferable under the circumstances. But we both pray and we both work for the restoration of the church. And in that sense, of course, we both pray for the reigning pontiff. And as far as is possible, we would support, the various initiatives that the Holy See proposes. So, for example, if there was a Jubilee year, we would celebrate the Jubilee year. In this year of St. Joseph, we are observing that. The Year of Mercy, etc. These kinds of initiatives, these kinds of intentions, we can happily work with. But when it comes to certain, we might say, disciplinary and doctrinal issues that are not in sync with and not in harmony with sacred tradition, then of course we can't go along with those. And that's why we maintain our distance, we might say. I think it's clear, I think it's important to appreciate that both for Old Romans and for the SSPX, we don't consider ourselves in schism. We don't consider ourselves separated from the church. We consider ourselves in communion with all who are faithful Catholics. And this is important, I think, with respect to Catholics generally. So there are some, let me just try and block out the noise from the next door neighbor's dog. So with regard to Novus Ordo Catholics, for want of a better term, for those Catholics who belong, for those Catholics who, well, for just Catholics, if they come to us and seek our ministrations, we would not turn them away. We would not make them jump through hoops to attend our chapels or to receive at our masses. A Catholic is a Catholic, and the only problem is where a Catholic may, as it would be for anywhere, where a Catholic might persist in heresy or persist in scandal, then obviously we abide by canon law and by the principles of canon law. But as far as we're concerned, Catholics are Catholics. If a Catholic comes to Mass, they are a Catholic. It's okay for them to make confession. It's okay for them to receive the Eucharist, etc. We don't make we don't, as it were, draw tribal lines of distinction or of difference in our regard to those who otherwise are not adherents, we might say. I think that's important to realize. And likewise then, with regard to other traditionalist Catholics, like the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King and so on and so forth, likewise, we would never say that their sacraments are questionable or invalid just because they're directly under the auspices of Rome, however problematic we think Rome is. And there are many souls, many priests, many clergy within those Ecclesia Dei communities and congregations and orders who do know what sacred tradition is, who do have the right and correct understanding and appreciation for and of sacred tradition, but for whatever reason stay where they are, no matter how problematic that may be for them. So I said to somebody the other day, for us as Old Romans, and indeed for the SSPX, it's not for us, as it were, in many ways to justify ourselves who believe that we are and can point to the authentic tradition and discipline and praxis of the Church. We don't have to justify ourselves for simply maintaining the faith and sacred tradition and the perennial magisterium. It's for others who have to justify their novelties and their accommodations and compromises with false or heretical notions and doctrines. So I think that's an important point. I think perhaps another cultural distinction and ethos between ourselves and the SPX in general, not in general, but not necessarily everywhere. As Old Romans, we tend to create communities. we do tend to create communities, and we have a very communal, pastoral, we might say, attitude, so that old Roman missions and oratories, we tend to encourage fellowship. We tend to encourage more than just communal worship, but study and other activities, particularly apostolates, addressing the needs of local communities. That for us as old Romans is very important. With the SSPX, sometimes, where you have a chapel where a priest visits it, perhaps once a month or once every 2 months, where you have an eclectic congregation of people who travel from many miles and for many hours to get to Mass. Appreciably, the thought of staying on to share time of fellowship, and the impracticalities of coming together to for catechesis or for an active apostolate or ministry of some kind to a local community, that's not going to happen. So sometimes one of the differences that people sometimes say of their experiences of going to SSPX and old Roman chapels is that they will often say that with old Roman chapels they feel a greater sense of welcome or hospitality, or fellowship and community, whereas with those SPX chapels that's less so. As I say, not always the case. The most famous example being St. Mary's, Kansas, in America. If you go there, there is a thriving traditional Catholic community centered around the SSPX run school and incredible basilica that they're building, the Immaculata. There, of course, that's a different situation, because many SSPX families have moved there and created a community. But that is exceptional. Whereas for us as old Romans, our emphasis is very much about creating local community and serving the local community. Another difference as well, I suppose, would be again along those lines. The SSPX invariably have no interaction with other clergy of other denominations. They don't get involved with, for example, in this country, there is generally in most cities and towns and large villages, there is something called churches together, where a mild form of ecumenical fellowship or relationship may be shared or realized or experienced between different churches. Now, for sure, we agree with the SSPX that the ecumenism propounded and generally expounded by Vatican II and by the spirit of Vatican II and by the contemporary Roman hierarchy is in error. We would agree with them on that, but that doesn't mean to say that therefore we shouldn't be charitable or sociable with people of other Christian confessions, or indeed of other religions or faiths. One of the one of the things I do, this is part of my ministry here, for example, is chair of the city's Faith Council. I'm also chair of trustees for a multi-faith social action charity. Now, but I don't practice false ecumenism. So I don't practice false syncretism or equivalency. I don't go around saying to the other religionists that their religion is as valid as mine. I don't say to the other clergy of other Christian confessions that that if they claim sacerdotality, if they claim apostolic succession, I don't say that theirs is the same as mine. But I can respect them. I can work with them in terms of addressing problems within the community that we live in together, and I see no contradiction there in doing that. But it is very clear, and some of them know, that I will not get involved in mixed worship services. I won't attend anything that's billed as an interfaith service. I invariably won't go with forms of worship with other Christians. I'm careful about what it is that I might attend, but there is no. But what I don't think that anyone who knows me ecumenically or interfaith wise in the city here would make the mistake of thinking that I believe some kind of syncretistic equivalence exists between their confessional faith and ours. Not at all. But what I do recognize is that spirituality is an inherent phenomena of humanity, and that I would hope that by my witness to the Catholic faith, that may indeed draw them or inspire them or provoke them to consider the authentic Catholic faith for themselves. So we started recently an ecumenical study group, that is to say a study group for Christians irrespective of denomination, and in it we discuss scripture, we discuss topics like mission, ethos within congregations, etc., all sorts of things, but there is no suggestion of false equivalence or false syncretism. We all know that we are from different traditions, and we just respect that. But nobody for a minute, I suspect, or I hope, thinks that I would regard anything that isn't Catholic as being equitable, as being the same, because that certainly isn't true. That certainly isn't true. Whereas, you see, the SSPX won't get involved with anything like that at all. Now, in part, that's probably because they tend to operate from priories where 2 or 3 priests are in one place, and they go out regularly to the different SSPX chapels within a geographical location to offer the Mass. So they're going in and out, as it were, of different places and communities. So there isn't the opportunity, perhaps, or point really, for them to get involved, as it were, in a local community. But personally, I think that's a great shame, and as I say, I would say that's a difference between Old Romans and SSPX, as that kind of working model. for us as Old Romans, I mean, we will gladly, as Old Romans, travel to provide the sacraments if asked, but we tend to focus our energies on creating local communities, local worshipping, regular worshipping community, and by extension get involved with the local community in which our mission or chapel is placed, and seek to serve the locality that we're in. So I'd say that is that's probably a bigger difference than I'm perhaps giving weight to it now, but that perhaps is a significant difference between Old Romans and the SSPX. You know, for us, although we are missionaries, for us, it's very much about missionizing in the local context. Whereas for the SSPX, it's about serving sacraments according to need or demand. So I suppose that would be the difference. And again, model-wise, for us as Old Romans, we tend to establish a mission, which we hope will become an oratory, and usually within a city or a largish town, and we encourage adherents to come to. So for us, we try to establish a regular place of worship, and we encourage people to come regularly to it. So grounding and founding ourselves within a locale. And then, as opposed to the SSPX Priory model, which is much more about servicing a wider geographical location. I would say too that another perhaps difference often between Old Roman missions and chapels and those of the SSPX is partly is the fact that we tend to have regular communities, but also too that we probably have more converts, so more people who become Catholic. The same is obviously the same is often true for the SSPX, but I would say probably on the whole for the SSPX, the majority of people who attend SSPX chapels are cradle Catholics, whereas I would say probably on the whole with Old Romans, there are cradle Catholics who come for the tradition, but there are often, I would say probably percentage-wise, a higher proportion of converts to Catholicism who may come from other Christian traditions or none at all. And that's probably because, again, of this slight difference in ethos of us placing ourselves, grounding ourselves deliberately within a community, and becoming recognizably a part of the wider community. So that would be, yes, I suppose that would be another difference. But of course, in terms of the worship, in terms of the administration of the sacraments, in terms of the applying the canonical principles and polity, etc., then we would be much the same. We perhaps have a greater dependency on the old canon law, the PO 1917 Code of Canon Law. We probably reference that more than the SSPX, who in recent years have started to refer to the new Code of Canon Law of 1983. Now that may be just because in the schema of apologetics. Now, of course, the vast majority of Catholics are more used to, or perhaps if they are familiar with canon law at all, are more likely to be more familiar with the 1983 code than in times past, when traditionalist Catholics, of course, before 1983, would have been very familiar with the 1917 code. So that perhaps is another slight difference between us. Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise, but I would say, you know, there are more similarities between us than differences, and certainly where it matters with regard to sacred tradition, with regard to the perennial magisterium, with regard to manifestation and living of the faith, we are very similar, and certainly with our understanding of the crisis in the church, we are very close, if not the same. Now, with regard to sedevacantists, so with those traditional Catholics who believe that there is no Pope, our regard is probably we're somewhat in some ways we are sort of between sedevacantism or sedevationism and recognize and resist. So if there was a spectrum, as it were, if there was a spectrum of those who totally and utterly believe the papacy is correct in every way, through to those who think that the Pope is a heretic and there is no Pope, we on that scale, on that spectrum, would be somewhere between. So the FSSP, etc., would be around here. The SSPX would be around here. We would be about there, and then the sedevacantists are right the way around here. And again, Old Romans and sedevacantists, very great similarities in terms of tradition. We, in our appreciation of tradition, of sacred tradition, we're probably nearer the sedevacantists than the SSPX, because the sedevacantists recognize too that there are errors with the 62 Missal and with the 55 Holy Week. But of course, and like us, they would have a greater affinity with the 1917 Code of Canon Law, the older form of canon law. But the difference between us would be, whereas they don't recognize the popes at all, we with the SSPX would say, well, unless the conclave can be proved to be invalid, then we have to assume that they were properly elected. Now there is, of course, there is a conspiracy theory about Pope Bergoglio's election. The St. Gallen Mafia, and I meant to say actually on Unscripted last Saturday was St. Gallen's Day, St. Gall, but the St. Gallen Mafia, this is a group of bishops and cardinals who began meeting in 1994 or 1995 in St. Gallen in Switzerland, and these were progressivists and modernists and liberals who essentially planned to try and take over the hierarchy in the papacy. They were founded by Cardinal Mario Marini, formerly of Milan, now deceased, of course, and included in their number were people like Cormac Murphy O'Connor of Westminster, Cardinal Daniels from Belgium, various other notable, well-known liberal cardinals. And it is said that in 2005, I think, when Benedict XVI was elected in that conclave, they had tried to garner support for Jorge Bergoglio then. And of course, in the conclave following Benedict XVI's abdication, they campaigned again for Jorge Bergoglio. Now, the problem with that is that according to the rules of conclave, campaigning is absolutely forbidden. The rules of conclave have not changed materially since, well, certainly since Pope Paul VI, if not John the 23rd. John Paul II sort of tidied them up a bit before he passed. Benedict XVI simply adopted, well, he didn't make any changes. So according to the rules of conclave for the election of a pope, the cardinals are forbidden from campaigning. They're not supposed to choose, as it were, ahead of the conclave a candidate, and they're not supposed to campaign and canvass votes. And yet, following the election of Pope Bergoglio, various commentators have said that campaigning, canvassing for votes went on specifically for Bergoglio. So Austin Ivry, in his biography of Cormac Murphy O'Connor, let it slip that Cormac had been a member of this St. Gallen gang, the St. Gallen group, or dubbed the Mafia by conservatives, and had actively campaigned and canvassed for the election of Bergoglio. Likewise, Cardinal Daniels also has admitted in public statements that and written that he too was actively canvassing votes and campaigning for Bergoglio at the last conclave. Now, in theory, and there are others, of course, and in theory, this should be picked up by somebody and an investigation held. And if proved, then the conclave should be declared null and void. But nobody is. Nobody is raising a flag. Nobody is investigating it, even despite the public statements admitting that canvassing of votes went on at the last conclave. And why? So why not? Well, in part because it suits certain people within positions of power in the Curia for things to be as they are. One of the things this canvassing or this campaigning wasn't just limited to the conclave itself, but has been, an ongoing movement generally within the hierarchy and within the powers that be for some time, so that, as it were, everything was arranged that should their candidate succeed, then other positions of power and influence were filled, or already filled, by sympathizers. So there were already bishops and archbishops in place sympathizing with this new movement. So there's no will, as it were, we might say, by those who have the power and the influence to do anything about it. There's no will on their part to do anything about it. They're happy with the situation. So I predict, I prophesy, but I predict that, in 50 years, 60 years time, perhaps, somebody will investigate it and it will be exposed, by which time it'll of course be too late to do anything about it, and the damage will already have been done, because let's face it, that's what's happening now. The released today a blogger, I think it was Tassati, one of the Italian Vaticanista bloggers, but anyway, speculating about the next consistory, the next making of cardinals, was pointing out that already Pope Bergoglio has appointed 70 of the College of Cardinals. That's 70, and he's likely, of course, to increase that number, not forgetting that some, I think the number was 38 or something, there are still 38 or something cardinals who voted for him at his election, at his conclave. So in other words, things are stacked up that at the next conclave you have 70 cardinals who owe their red hats to the current regime, and you have about 40 cardinals who elected the current regime, who will still be eligible to vote then. So things are not looking good, folks, as I've said before. If you're hoping that at the next conclave, if you're praying that the Holy Spirit will choose the next pope, then I'm afraid you're on a hide into nothing, quite probably, because there just won't be a candidate suitable left within the college who is eligible. Certainly there are only a handful of traditional or traditionalist-minded cardinals who will still be eligible to vote in the next conclave. So it's a sort of a done deal. And this is perhaps why certain voices are becoming bolder in their public statements of late, like Francis himself, of course, talking about not a new church but a different church, which essentially means the same thing. Archbishop Roche, who is the new prefect for the Congregation of Divine Worship in the Sacraments, who said that, who has stated publicly that the new Mass is here to stay, that it is what the Second Vatican Council wanted, etc. This is despite the fact that clearly it is not. You only have to read Sacrosanctum Concilium and look at the Novus Ordo Missae to know that the thing is, these two things are wildly different. And you have the chap who is the Cardinal, present Cardinal of State, Secretary of State, who seems to be overreaching his remit, has seemingly taken over the running of St. Peter's Basilica, so that the canons have been compromised, the residentiary canons, that he's the one who has abolished essentially private masses in the Basilica, so on and so forth. You know, this is the next generation. Well, this is the current regime, and they're going to continue going forward. You know, Archbishop Roche is more than likely to be given a red hat, being prefect of a major congregation. And then there are other quite probable contenders. Monseigneur Aupetit, who is the Archbishop of Paris, he's been waiting for a red hat for a long time. Perhaps he pointedly did what he did re the implementation of Traditionis Custodes in the Archdiocese of Paris, where he summarily got rid of most of the traditional Latin masses that were regularly being offered in that archdiocese. They're now reduced to, I think, 3 or 4 or 5. Perhaps he was currying favor with Francis, with a view to getting his red hat. There's even a suggestion that James Martin, of all people, the controversialist Jesuit, his name was even being bandied around at possibly getting a red hat. It's you know, these are crazy times. These are crazy times. So what does that mean, of course, for the rest of us? Well, it means from an old Roma perspective, we've we've already been at this for some 170 years already, since 1853, and we're not going to change. So for us, it probably means more of the same. There was a hope, I have to say, and I did actually write a letter to Benedict XVI to begin discussions. There was a hope we had when Benedict was Pope that we might have begun to have serious talks, but wasn't to be. He abdicated. That was the end of that. So with things looking the way they are, especially re the next conclave, and certainly re the contemporary regime, I don't see much change in that going forward. So for us as old Romans, we will continue as we always have done. Our Sedevacantis brethren, of course, no change for them either. And it is to be hoped that re the SSPX, they will continue with their process of distance and resistance. As I said the other day, it got a bit close there, a bit dicey there, in the sort of around 2010, when many of us thought that Bishop Fellay was going to capitulate, and for any kind of accommodation, but he didn't. So at present, the SSPX are doing the right thing. I doubt very much that will change. It is, of course, fascinating, ironic even, that the present accommodations given to the SSPX have been given by Francis, who has given them faculties to hear confessions and to solemnize marriages. Nobody really understands that. Whether or not Francis's successor will continue with that, who knows? For our part, we're not bothered about that at the moment, because there's more important things to worry about, re the faith. So going forward, I'm happy to say that there will be no change for us as old Romans, unless, of course, Maranatha, unless, of course, our Lord returns. That, of course, will shake everything up. That will sort the chiff from the chaff. And as I keep saying, it's over 2,000 years now. So the time is drawing nearer of our Lord's return. And we, all of us, should certainly pray for that. We should certainly pray for that. Why wouldn't we pray for that? We want heaven. We want his kingdom to come. We should all be, as faithful Catholics, praying, Maranatha, may the Lord come, and quickly. And that, of course, as I said, well, that would solve everything, wouldn't it? That would. But if that's, but as God wills, Deo volente. Meanwhile, we must continue to do what we've always done, and we can do no other, and that is simply to remain steadfast to the perennial Catholic faith, to that which has always been believed everywhere and by all. That's all we can do, and that's all we will do. And so that is a promise, that is a guarantee you can take from us. I'd like to think that the SSPX will do the same. Until now, they have. So I would like to think that they will continue. And we will just have to, see what happens. It was prophesied, remember, it was long ago prophesied that there would be a remnant. Long before St. Francis. St. Francis prophesied this, and before St. Francis there were others, and there have been many others since St. Francis until now. Our Lady herself, at practically every apparition, every time she has appeared in the last 200 years, has spoken about this, warned us about this, and has advised us on the attitude to take, and on the devotions to say and to pray, and that's all we can do. But meanwhile, that doesn't mean to say that we cannot proselytize and evangelize. We must and we ought. And this is, again, I think perhaps something that is slightly different between us as Old Romans and, I would say, all other traditional Catholics. For us as Old Romans, the mission and the Great Commission is still utterly relevant. We, all of us, have an obligation charged by Christ himself to proclaim the gospel and to attempt to save souls. It's not enough to create our traditionalist enclaves and just focus on ourselves, as it were, to pull up the drawbridges and close the windows and huddle the tabernacle. That's not the approach of us as Old Romans, and shouldn't be the approach of any faithful traditional and Orthodox Catholic. We should be seeking to convert souls. For sure, we should be seeking to counsel our brothers and sisters as Catholics. We should be doing our best to try to take the scales from their eyes so that they can see and recognize the situation for what it is, and resist accordingly. But at the same time, too, we should also be going out and trying to save souls. As Old Romans, we don't hold with this kind of insular, isolationist kind of attitude that many traditional Catholics do. That itself is fundamentally contrary to the faith. Fundamentally contrary to the faith. The Great Commission is something that we are all charged with and should all be about. Our world needs the gospel. Our world needs the gospel. And just because we may think that prophecy is being realized in a remnant, faithful, group is all that's going to be left, doesn't mean to say that God doesn't will nor desire that other souls should be saved. Of course he does. And that comes down to us. So I'm afraid I don't have much truck with those who call themselves traditional Catholics but do nothing in the way of evangelism. Because that's just not Christian, you see. And if that's not Christian, then we're not truly Catholic, are we? We should all be doing what we can to save souls. We can pray. If we're not a great missionary, if we're not a great evangelist, if we're not a great orator or rhetorician, then we can pray. We can pray for the conversion of souls. God knows we should be praying for the conversion of Pope Bergoglio. and of the hierarchy, but also we should be praying for the conversion of our neighbors, of our friends, of our family, of our loved ones, of those we love, everyone. We should be praying the conversion of our communities, praying for the conversion of our society, praying for the conversion of our nations, praying for the conversion of the world. We should all be praying for conversions, but also too, we should also be actively testifying to our faith by living the faith, by being seen demonstrably to be living the faith, by manifesting charity and mercy. Remember the two chief lessons of yesterday's liturgy for the 21st Sunday after Pentecost. One, to recognize and realize that we are engaged in a spiritual battle, that, you know, it's not just those who kill the body we must fear, but those who have the power to kill the soul and the body together. So realize that this applies to the crisis in the church. This applies to the crisis in our world, the topsy-turvydom of our world today. You know, but primarily this is a spiritual battle. And secondly, we must ourselves have mercy. We must ourselves demonstrate mercy. We mustn't be like the wicked servant who was forgiven everything by his master, but who wouldn't forgive his colleague. There's an important lesson in that parable that many people miss. Because when that wicked servant was condemned, everything that had been previously forgiven him was taken away. So we must remember that ourselves. If we want to be saved, if we want God to be merciful to us, we in turn must be merciful to others. That's the same lesson again as the Good Samaritan. So remember that, and remember that with regard to, you know, those who aren't traditional Catholics but ought to be. You know, sometimes, especially online, you know, traditional Catholics have a very bad reputation for condemning everybody as well as each other, left, right, and centre all the time. We cannot have any truck with that. There is no need for that, and it's not the way to convert souls. You do not convert souls by peremptorily and assuming to oneself the prerogative to judge and condemn them. That's never the way, never the way. Okay, well, a mixed bag for today's show, perhaps, but I hope it was interesting. I hope you learned something from it, and I hope it was encouraging too. You know, at the end of the day, my brothers and sisters, if we are striving for holiness, if we are faithful to God's commandments, to Christ's teachings, and put our faith and our hope and our trust in Christ's promises, if we live humbly and with a contrite heart, we have nothing to fear and everything to gain. Nothing to fear and everything to gain. And we just have to trust in God. As an old Roman bishop, Arnold Matthew, once said, his motto was, what God wills will be. And that, after all, can only be our prayer on anything, that God's will be. Dominus vobiscum, et cum spirito tuo, sit nomen Domini benedictum, ex hoc nunc usque in saecula, auditor nostrum in nomine Domini, qui feci caelum et terram, benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, descendet super vos, et maneat semper. Amen. God bless you, and thank you for watching. And yes, just to answer quickly that note, Yes, Sensus Fidelium, another channel on YouTube of Traditionalist Catholics, got banned today from YouTube. It'll be interesting to learn from Stephen what excuse YouTube give him, because he didn't receive any pre-warnings. The channel just disappeared. Those of you who are familiar with the old Roman.com will know that we share lots of videos from Sensus Fidelium. We live, as the Chinese say, in interesting times. Remember, that's a curse, but we live in interesting times. But that doesn't mean to say that we have anything to fear. We do have a channel on Rumble. We don't use it very much at the moment, but if needs must, when the devil drives, then we certainly shall. And I believe that Sensus Fidelium is also on Rumble and some other outlets as well. Fortunately, they archived everything that they had on the channel some time ago, so they haven't lost all that wonderful stuff that they had. So we'll just have to watch this space, as it were, on YouTube and see what happens. See if they reappear. See if we're giving a heads up as to what YouTube may be using to discriminate against us. We'll have to see. Okay. Remember, the next live broadcast on this channel will be tomorrow, the traditional Latin Mass at 8:30 a.m. British summertime. That's UTC or GMT +1 for those of you who are abroad. Meanwhile, take care of yourselves. If you're able, and if you haven't already, please do consider becoming a patron, and then we could do more in terms of this apostolate. If you can't be a Patreon patron, then please see in the notes there are various options for one-off donations, which are very gratefully received. Otherwise, do join us every day for the Rosary if you're able. We're more than happy to receive your intentions and to pray for them there. Okay, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, always, God loves you.